There is a silence that is more than just the absence of sound. It has a presence. A heavy, soft thing that settles in a room, on a chair, on a shoulder. It's the silence of a story left untold, a memory never shared, a laugh that has nowhere to go. This is the story of that silence, and of the man who lived within it. His name was Arthur. Arthur's world was measured not in miles, but in moments. It was a small world, contained within the four walls of the house he had lived in for 45 years. A house that had once roared with life, now only whispered with memory. Each day was a careful, quiet ritual, a dance performed for an audience of one. The day began, as it always did, with a deep, resonant chime of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Bong, bong, 7 times. Arthur didn't even need to open his eyes. He knew the sound of 7. It was different from 6, different from 8. He knew the way the light would be slanting through the blinds, painting stripes of gold on the worn, floral carpet. He knew the precise temperature of the air. He knew the day of the week, the month. This predictability was the armor he wore against the vast, unpredictable emptiness of time. He would rise, his joints complaining in a familiar chorus of pops and creaks that echoed the house's own settling sounds. He'd make his way to the kitchen, his slippers whispering on the hardwood floor. The ritual of coffee was a sacrament. The scoop of the grounds a gurgle of the machine, the slow pour into his favorite mug, the one his daughter had made him in a long-ago pottery class. It was a little lopsided, with world's best dad faded from 1,000 washes. He would carry it to the small formica-top table by the window, sit down, and wait. He was waiting for the postman. Not because he expected anything important. The mail was mostly catalogs for things he didn't need and bills for things he already had, but because the postman's arrival was a punctuation mark in the long, run-on sentence of his morning. 10:15. He could set his watch by the crunch of tires on the gravel, the slam of the van door, the soft thud of the mail slot. Sometimes, if it was a magazine, he could stretch out reading it for a whole hour. Other times, it was only minutes. After the mail, there was the crossword puzzle. He did it in pen, a habit from his teaching days, a show of confidence. He was still good at it. His mind a sharp repository of archaic words, historical dates, and literary quotes. But completing it felt less like a victory, and more like the closing of a small, daily door. One more thing done, one less thing to do. The house was a museum of a life lived. Photographs covered every surface, frozen moments smiling out from silver frames. There was Arthur, young and dark-haired, his arm around Eleanor on a beach in Cape Cod. Both of them were squinting into the sun, her head thrown back in a mid-laugh. He could almost hear that laugh, even now. It had a particular sound, like bells, a sound that could cut through any gloom. That was the melody of his life for 48 years. Eleanor's laughter. There was the photo of their daughter, Sarah, at her graduation, her cap askew, her future a bright, wide-open road. That road had led her to Seattle, 2,000 miles away. Now she had a husband, 2 busy teenagers, and a life that spun so fast. Arthur felt dizzy just hearing about it on their weekly Sunday calls. There were photos of friends, too. Friends from the school where he'd taught history for 3 decades. Friends from the neighborhood. The gang from the Saturday morning golf game. Their faces, now mostly gone or dispersed, looked out at him. Their smiles were eternal. Their company a ghostly presence in the quiet rooms. Loneliness, for Arthur, wasn't a dramatic, wrenching pain. It wasn't a sob in the dark, though he had known those too, in the first raw year after Eleanor was gone. No, this was a different creature. It was a low, constant hum, like the sound of a refrigerator you only notice when it suddenly shuts off. It was the feeling of being a spectator to your own life, watching the replay of a movie whose ending you already knew. It was the simple, crushing weight of inconsequence. The deep, unshakable feeling that if he were to vanish, the world would not hiccup. The mail would still come at 10:15. The clock would still chime. The sun would still make its stripes on the carpet. His absence would be just another silence in a house already full of them. He tried to explain it once to Sarah, during one of her whirlwind visits. They were sitting right here at this very table. "I'm fine, honey. Don't you worry about me," he'd said. It was the automatic response of a parent who doesn't want to be a burden. She'd looked at him, her eyes, so like her mother's, filled with a love that was layered with concern and a faint, unspoken guilt. "But are you lonely, Dad? I mean, really? You should get out more. Join a club. There's that senior center downtown. I read online they have bridge tournaments." He had smiled and patted her hand. "I'll look into it," he'd said. And he meant it in that moment. But the thought of walking into a room full of strangers, of having to perform a version of himself that was sociable and interested, felt as daunting as climbing a mountain. It was easier to stay here in his familiar silence than to risk the awkward, exhausting effort of trying to break it. And so his world had shrunk. It was the house, the grocery store on Tuesdays, the park bench on sunny afternoons. He had become a ghost in the machine of his own life, going through the motions, waiting for what he didn't know. Then, one Tuesday, during his weekly pilgrimage to the supermarket, something shifted. It was a small thing, a nothing. He was in the cereal aisle, looking for his bran flakes, when a young father with a toddler in his cart came rushing around the corner. The cart clipped Arthur's heel. "Oh, geez." "I'm so sorry, sir," the young man said, his face flushed and harried. The toddler was wailing, and a box of brightly colored sugar bombs had fallen to the floor. "It's quite all right," Arthur said, his voice sounding rusty from disuse. "No harm done." The young man gave him a distracted, grateful smile, scooped up the cereal, shushed his child, and rushed off down the aisle. His life was a messy, loud, vibrant hurricane. Arthur stood for a long moment, watching them go. He remembered those days. The exhaustion, the chaos, the feeling of being pulled in a dozen directions at once. He remembered wishing, sometimes, for just 5 minutes of quiet. He almost laughed out loud at the irony. He had nothing but quiet now, an endless supply. He would have given anything in that moment, to trade all of it for one more chaotic, cereal-filled morning with a young Sarah and a tired, beautiful Eleanor. The encounter left him feeling more hollow than usual. He finished his shopping, the few items rattling around in the large cart. At the checkout, the young cashier with a nose ring and tired eyes scanned his items without a word, until she got to the bran flakes. "My granddad used to eat these," she said, almost to herself. Arthur looked up, startled. "Did he?" "Yeah, every morning, with a sliced banana. Said it kept him, you know." She made a vague gesture. "Regular." Arthur managed a small smile. "That's the general idea." She gave him a real smile then, not just a customer service automatism. "You have a good day, okay?" "You too," Arthur said. And for a moment, that simple, human exchange felt like a lifeline. It was the most anyone had spoken to him, beyond functional necessity, in days. It warmed a tiny, frozen part of him. But as he walked out into the parking lot, the feeling faded, replaced by the familiar silence, now somehow louder for having been briefly interrupted. The next day, he went to the park. It was his usual spot, a bench beneath a large, spreading oak tree that overlooked a pond. It was a good bench. It was positioned just right to see the ducks, the children playing on the swings, the couples walking hand in hand. He was a watcher, a chronicler of other people's lives. He would make up stories about them in his head. That young couple over there? They were newlyweds, still in that blissful bubble. The man pushing a stroller? A new father, proud and terrified. The group of teenagers? They were trying on adulthood, their laughter too loud, their gestures too dramatic. He was a novelist without a pen, creating narratives to fill the void of his own. On this particular day, a woman sat down on the other end of his bench. This was unusual. The park had many benches, and this one, his bench, was usually left for him. She was around his age, he guessed, perhaps a few years younger. She had a kind, lined face and short, curly gray hair. She was feeding the ducks with pieces of bread from a brown paper bag, tearing them meticulously into small pieces. They sat in silence for a while, the only sounds being the quacking of ducks and the distant squeak of the swings. Arthur pretended to read his newspaper. She continued feeding the ducks. After some time, she spoke. Her voice was soft, but clear. "They're greedy today, aren't they?" Arthur lowered his paper. Pardon. She gestured with a piece of bread. The ducks. They're usually more polite. Today it's a free-for-all. Arthur looked at the squabbling birds. He'd never really thought about their manners. I suppose it is, he said. I'm Margaret, she said, not looking at him, but tossing another piece of bread. Arthur. Pleasure, Arthur. And that was it. She finished her bread, brushed the crumbs from her lap, gave him a small nod, and left. Arthur sat for a long time after she had gone, the newspaper forgotten on his lap. It wasn't a conversation of any consequence. It was banal, silly even. But it was a conversation. It was a shared observation. A tiny crack in the wall of his solitude. He found himself looking for her the next day. He felt a little foolish, but he went to the park at the same time. And there she was on their bench. Well, his bench. Their bench? She had the brown paper bag again. They're back to their usual, civilized selves today, she said by way of greeting, as if their conversation had only paused, not ended, the day before. Arthur sat down. Good to hear. I was worried we had a bad influence on them. She chuckled. It was a nice sound. Doubtful. They're creatures of habit, just like us. They talked for a half hour. It was easy, meandering talk. About the weather. About the city's plan to repave the park paths. About the best brand of coffee. She was a retired librarian. Her husband had passed away 5 years ago. She had a son in Chicago. The parallels were so stark it was almost funny. They were living variations on the same theme. He learned that she came to this park every day, too. That she, like him, had her rituals. But hers seemed less like a prison and more like a gentle framework. She volunteered at the library 2 days a week, reading to children. She was part of a book club. She had a life. You should come to book club, she said, as if reading his mind. It's next Thursday. We're reading a dreadful mystery novel, but the company is good and there's cake. Arthur felt a familiar panic rise in his chest. A room full of people. Strangers. Having to talk about a book he might not even like. Oh, I don't know. I'm not much of a joiner. Neither was I, Margaret said simply. Until I was. It's that, or go mad talking to the ducks. She said it with a twinkle in her eye, taking the sting out of it. He didn't commit. But he thought about it. For the rest of the week, the thought of the book club buzzed in the back of his mind. A tiny, persistent fly of possibility. It was terrifying. But the terror felt different from the emptiness. It was a feeling at least. It was alive. The day of the book club arrived. Arthur spent the morning in a state of high anxiety. He changed his shirt 3 times. He rehearsed what he might say about the book, which he had, in fact, gone to the library and checked out and read. It was, as Margaret had promised, dreadful. The protagonist was an idiot. The plot was full of holes. He could say that. But would that be rude? At 1 o'clock, the time he needed to leave to make it, he was still sitting in his armchair, paralyzed. It's easier to stay, the old, familiar voice whispered in his ear. It's warm here. It's safe. You know this silence. You don't know that room. What if you have nothing to say? What if they all look at you? What if you're just a sad, old man intruding on their club? He looked at the clock. 1:05. He had missed his chance. A wave of relief, immediately followed by a deeper, more profound wave of shame and disappointment, washed over him. He had failed. He had chosen the silence. Again, he stood up, angry at himself. He paced the living room, his footsteps loud in the quiet house. He looked at the photograph of Eleanor on the mantelpiece. She was smiling her brilliant, fearless smile. She had never been afraid of a room. She would walk into a party of strangers and leave with 5 new friends. She would have dragged him to that book club, kicking and complaining, and he would have ended up having a wonderful time. I can't do it, Ellie, he said aloud, his voice cracking. I'm not you. But her smile in the photograph seemed to challenge him. It said, no, you're not me. You're you. And you're still here. At 1:20, in a sudden impulsive act that felt entirely foreign to him, he grabbed his coat and walked out the door. He didn't allow himself to think. He just moved, 1 foot in front of the other, towards a community center where the club was meeting. He was late. He could hear the murmur of voices from behind the closed door of the meeting room. His hand trembled as he reached for the knob. He pushed it open. A dozen faces turned to look at him. Mostly women, a few other men. They were seated in a circle. And there, in the middle of them, was Margaret. Her face broke into a warm, genuine smile. "Arthur," she said, "you made it. Come in, we saved you a seat." It was a lie. He could see there was no empty seat, but someone quickly shuffled and pulled up an extra chair. He sat down, his heart hammering against his ribs. They were in the middle of a heated debate about the motive of the butler. "I think Arthur just arrived," the woman leading the discussion said. "What did you think of the book, Arthur?" All eyes were on him. He swallowed. He could feel the old urge to retreat, to mutter it was fine, and disappear. But he thought of Eleanor's smile. He thought of the silent house waiting for him. He took a breath. "I thought it was preposterous," he said, his voice stronger than he expected. The butler clearly had no alibi for Chapter 3, and the author just ignored it. It was lazy writing. A moment of silence. Then, a man across the circle snorted with laughter. "Thank you," he boomed. "I've been saying that for 20 minutes. And just like that, the conversation swallowed him up. He argued, he laughed, he listened. He ate a slice of lemon cake that was, indeed, very good. He didn't say much more, but he was part of the circle. He was connected. Walking home an hour later, the world felt different. The air seemed sharper, the colors brighter. The silence of his house, when he opened the door, was no longer a heavy presence waiting for him. It was just quiet, and quiet could be peaceful, not just lonely. He went to the book club the next month, and the month after that. He started having coffee with Margaret in the park on the days the club didn't meet. He met her other friends. He even tentatively started telling his own stories about teaching, about Eleanor, about the time he and his friends tried to build a boat and it sank in the pond on the very first day. People laughed. They listened. He didn't become the life of the party. His world was still relatively small, but the walls of that world had expanded. They had windows now, and doors that opened to let other people in. The silence was still there, sometimes. It would always be a part of him, a scar from the years of loss and isolation. But it was no longer the whole of him. One Sunday, he was on the phone with his daughter, Sarah. "You sound good, Dad," she said, her voice laced with surprise. "Really good. What have you been up to?" "Oh, this and that," Arthur said, a smile in his voice. "I joined a book club." "You did? That's wonderful. What are you reading?" "Some terrible spy thriller," Arthur said. "The plot is full of holes. I can't wait to tell them all about it." Sarah laughed, a real, relieved, happy laugh. It was a sound that traveled 2,000 miles and filled his kitchen, blending with the ticking of the clock and the memory of Eleanor's bells. It was a new melody, fragile but growing. It was the sound of a story continuing. It was the sound of a silence, finally, being heard and gently, kindly answered.